So hello, my colleagues, and I do hope everyone is well. So what I want to talk about here is where we left off with the chapter 9, right here on profitable growth. Okay, and basically equation 912 shows that when you looked at equation 912 up here, it shows that a firm can increase its growth rate right by retaining more of its earnings. And I guess that kind of makes sense, right? You retain your earnings and you grow the company like Google does. However, if the firm retains more earnings, it will be able to pay out less of those earnings. And according to equation 9.8, will have to reduce its dividend, right? So, and that should be obvious, right? So if a firm wants to increase its share price, should it cut its dividend and invest more? And this is always the big question. Or should it cut its investment, right, and increase its dividend? Not surprisingly, the answer depends on the profitability of the firm's investments. So let's look at an example here. So here's example 9.3, and this is an interesting example, right? Cutting dividends for profitable growth. Crane Sporting Goods expects to have earnings per share of $6 in the coming year. Rather than invest those earnings and grow, the firm plans to pay out all of its earnings as a dividend. Well, could be a problem, right? With these expectations of no growth, Crane's current share price is $60. Suppose Crane could cut its dividend payout rate to 75% for the foreseeable future and use the retained earnings to open new stores. The return on this investment in these stores is expected to be 12%, right? So assuming its equity cost of capital is unchanged, what effect would this new policy have on Crane's stock price? So that's the big question here, okay, if they're going to basically give out a dividend, right, of only 75% here. So this is kind of the solution to this, all right? So first, let's estimate Crane's equity. We got to estimate the Crane's equity cost of capital, right? So currently, Crane plans to pay a dividend equal to its earnings of $6 per share. Okay, so we pop that in, right? Given a share price of $60, Crane's dividend yield is 6 over 60 is 10%, right? So that's 10%. So that's where this comes from right here. 6 over 60 gives us this 10%. With no growth, right, basically we can use equation 9.7, right, that we had to estimate the equity cost of capital, right, because they're not going to grow. So it's 10%. So that's their equity cost of capital. To justify Crane's stock price under its current policy, the expected return of other stocks in the market with equivalent risk have to equal 10%, okay? Next now, we consider the consequences of the new policy. If Crane reduces its dividend payout to 75%, then from equation 9.8, its dividend this coming year will fall to, so basically earnings per share, right, times 75%, is 6 times 75, will be 450, right? At the same time, because the firm will now retain 25% of its earnings to invest in new stores from equation 912, its growth rate will be increased too. So here's the retention rate, and here's the return on new investments, right? So they're going to get basically a 3% growth rate, right? So you have a retention rate of 25%. and basically their return on any new investment, and that 12% was given to you, right? So if we look here, right, the return on its investments in these new stores is going to be 12%. All right, so we have that. All right, so we got that. Assuming Crane can continue to grow at this rate, we can compare its share price under the new policy using the constant dividend growth model. So here's the dividend. Here is the 3% growth rate. Here's the equity cost of capital. And the price of the share now comes out to $64.29, right? And basically that 10%, so you're clear, that 10% was what they calculated here. So this is assuming the same dividend yield, right? Because that's they've got a constant equity cost of capital. So the share price is going to rise from 60 to 64.29 if it cuts its dividend to invest in projects that offer a 12% greater offer return 12% greater than their cost of capital, which we assume remains at 10%. Okay? Which is what we saw right there, right? So these projects are positive net present value, and so by taking them, Crane has created value for its shareholders, right? Which is good. So I think that's a good thing. So let's listen to this video and see if we can hear this and how this plays out.
Cutting dividends for profitable growth. In this example, we're going to consider a firm's decision to potentially cut its dividend and reduce the amount of cash it's paying out to its shareholders in order to invest that cash and increase the firm's future growth rate. Before we start this problem, let's look back at the formula we derived for the constant dividend growth model of the firm. There we can see that both dividends and the firm's growth rate should have a positive impact on the firm's share price. Dividends increase the share price by increasing the numerator in this equation, while as growth increases the share price by decreasing the denominator. In this example, we're going to explore the trade-off between these two effects. When should we be willing to cut dividends in order to boost the firm's growth? Let's begin the problem by writing down the current information that we have about the firm. First, we know that Crane plans to pay out all of its earnings as dividends this year. In other words, its planned first-year dividend is equal to earnings per share in the coming year, which is $6. Next, we know that with this payout policy, shareholders are expecting no future growth. So the growth rate is simply 0. Finally, we're told that Crane's current share price, P0, is equal to $60 per share. So this summarizes the current information we have about Crane's stock price. So what can we learn with this information? Notice that we have the firm's current share price together with expectations for its future dividends. This information should allow us to estimate Crane's current equity cost of capital. In particular, recall that we can rearrange the constant dividend growth model equation as follows. The firm's equity cost of capital should equal its current dividend yield, dividends divided by price, plus the firm's expected growth rate. Using the information above, this is equal to $6 dividend divided by a $60 share price, plus our growth rate of 0%, or in other words, a total of 10% equity cost of capital. That is, if there's no expectation of growth, the equity cost of capital is just equal to the firm's dividend yield, in this case, 10%. Let's go ahead and use this information to see what we might expect to happen under the firm's new policy. Recall that under the new policy, Crane is going to cut its payout rate to 75%. Thus, its new dividend will equal its earnings per share times that payout rate. which in this case will be the $6 earnings per share times the 75% payout rate, or $4.50 per share.
Next, we need to
evaluate what will happen to Crane's growth rate under the new policy.
We can estimate
the firm's new growth rate by looking at its retention rate, which is simply 1 minus the payout rate,
times the
return that it's expected to earn on those new investments.
In Crane's case,
the
retention rate will be
25%. That's 1 minus the payout rate of 75%.
times
The return on new investments of 12%
for
for an expected growth rate of 3%.
Now that we've estimated
the new dividend rate and growth rate, we're ready to forecast the impact on Crane's share price.
For that, we're
going to use the constant dividend growth model formula, which says that the firm's share price should equal
its next year dividend
divided by its equity cost of capital minus the growth rate.
In Crane's case,
the new dividend is $4.50 per share.
the growth rate
is 3%,
and the firm's equity
cost of capital we're going to assume stays at the 10% rate that we estimated earlier.
In other words, we're
assuming that Crane's risk and therefore its cost of capital is unaffected by this change in policy.
Okay.
We're ready to calculate the final result and estimate the impact on Crane's share price. In this case, dividing $4.50 by the denominator of 7%, we get an estimated share price of $64.29.
Comparing that
to Crane's initial price of $60 per share, we can see that under the new policy, we expect the share price to significantly rise.
Why is that the case?
Recall that under the new policy, Crane is expecting to make new investments with a 12% return.
On the other hand,
we evaluated based on its current policy that its cost of capital is only 10%.
Thus, these new
investments represent a positive NPV opportunity for Crane.
They
have a higher return than Crane's cost of capital.
As a result,
Crane is adding value by making these new investments, and it's not surprising that its share price should rise.
That need not always be
the
case, however, as our next example will illustrate.
All right, so and we'll go into that next example next time.